Why Can't We Sleep? Understanding Our Sleeping and Sleepless Minds. Sleep is being sold. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Sigmund Freud claims, "I am a great sleeper. Not everyone is as fortunate. Sleep deprivation affects at least 1 out of every 3 adults, and the use of sleeping drugs has risen considerably in recent decades. Sleep clinics, which were once uncommon, are now commonplace at most large hospitals, as well as shopping malls and spas in the United States. People take sleeping medications in order to stay awake the next day, just as many of us rely on coffee and energy drinks to maintain an artificial level of arousal during the day. Sleep, which was formerly thought to be a natural state, has now become a commodity, something we must struggle for and never know if we have. Almost every day, newspapers, websites, and television shows feature a new story about sleep. How much of it we need, what happens if we don't get enough, and how much money the economy loses due to sleepy workers, as if a new philosopher's stone had been discovered. Sleep professionals disseminated their advice and thoughts. Anxiety, depression, and failure have all been linked to a lack of restful sleep. Instead of considering insomnia as a result of a depressive condition, causality is reversed. We are depressed because we haven't slept. Sleep facts that have been known for over a century are now being promoted as cutting-edge science. The relationship between sleep and memory was thoroughly investigated in the 19th century, but the same beliefs are reappearing as if they were only recently found. This newfound enthusiasm for sleep research will undoubtedly fade with time, but we must examine why it is happening now. Is it just that we're desperate to find a universal explanation for our problems that we resort to the one aspect of human life that can't respond? Is it possible that the digital society we live in has triggered a new wave of sleep problems? Emails, texts, and social media posts pile up as we lie in bed, and it feels as if the demands of the outside world are endless. Many individuals check their phones before going to bed, and even while sleeping, and then reach for them again when they wake up. The blue light from our screens, according to sleep scientists, will interfere with the process of falling asleep, but the demands themselves will almost certainly have a greater impact. There is no pause in the action. We are constantly told things, shown things, asked questions, and forced to do things, and reminded when we don't. We can no longer truly be off, much like the sleep mode on our phones, which is a sort of being on. Is this to say that there is a new sense of urgency to do just that, to turn oneself off? The irony is that, since we can't seem to stop the never-ending barrage of demands, sleeping has now been added to the list. It's like if a light bulb with an electrical current running through it is telling the current to turn itself off. The exhortation to switch off the flow has inflated the constant flow of messages and imperatives that form our environment, where traditionally rich people were expected to go to find calm at spas and wellness centers. Sleep is now sold as one's own personal getaway. There are a lot of business options here. Sleep is for everyone, rich and poor alike, whereas spas are for the wealthy few. Mattress commercials, which were once uncommon, are now commonplace during commercial breaks and web feeds, and the sleep aid sector is expected to produce $76.7 billion this year alone. Even though one early research from Edinburgh University in the 1950s claimed that there wasn't much of a difference in sleep time between utilizing a wooden board and a fancy spring mattress, the drab rectangle is now marketed as the necessary doorway to sleep. Your troubles are less to blame for your insomnia than the fact that your mattress isn't up to par. The enormous pressure placed on us to sleep in the proper manner has allowed the mattress industry to flourish, just as the media continually tells us what foods to consume and how much exercise to get. We are now being told how and when we should sleep, and the more widely these norms are spread, the more departures from them are labeled as disorders or illnesses. If there were only a few sleep disorders a few decades ago, there are now more than 70. With more illnesses, there are more cures, experts, and revenue. What is overlooked here is both visible and unseen. We can be advised how to sleep, but we can't be told how to process the advice. Will let the pressure to sleep well get in the way of our sleep if we read an article that explains why an 8-hour sleep is necessary for our health and advises us on how to attain it? For years, insomniacs have been warning us that the more we are told to concentrate on sleeping, the more the concept itself will keep us awake. Despite this, we live in a world where we are constantly pressured to live a healthy lifestyle, control our bodies, and try our best to sleep deeply and restfully. This essential strikes us as we wake up, as we calculate how long we were able to sleep. For those who believe in human evolution, the image is sobering. Instead of waking up millennia ago and starting the chores of the day, we now wake up and check a clock to compare our sleeping hours to a norm. And the more norms there are, the more people who don't fit within them. Variations in how we sleep become sleep disorders, erasing the diversity that we are supposed to cherish elsewhere. As a result, many people wake up with a sense of failure, beginning their day with an internal judgment that they have failed at a task, and fretting about the consequences. The new health discourse's math of self-reproach and salvation is uncannily similar to the function that the church formerly performed. Just as the church's prescriptions shaped both the mind and the physical with its standards of conduct and judgment, we now change the ways we live and think based on what we learn from biomedicine, the dominant belief system in the Western world. This conversation has a big impact on how much fruit we eat, how we exercise, and how we sleep. We count our pieces of fruit, our laps, our steps, and our hours of sleep where the church would count sins and transgressions, just as theologians debated the validity of their spiritual quantifications endlessly. Today's vitamin intake, fruit consumption, sleep hours, cholesterol, and blood pressure thresholds are frequently revised. Whatever the merits of such developments, don't they reflect a fundamental need to define the body in numerical terms? Don't we desire a hard and fast figure to distinguish between health and illness, right and wrong? There is a presumption here that putting numbers to the body lends some level of reality to the assertions, even if they are virtually always questioned or altered afterwards. After years of being told to consume 5 fruits and veggies each day, recent research claims that the number should actually be 10. However, there is a significant gap between 5 and 10. Such large revisions rarely make a dent in the gap between 5 and 10. People's faith in modern science is rarely shaken by such massive revisions, despite the fact that the history of science and medicine is littered with them, ranging from the age of the universe to the amount of dark matter to the ratio of neuroglial cells to neurons, all of which have been increased by more than a factor of 2. Consider what would happen if sleep experts told us that 8 hours was insufficient, and that we required 16 hours of sleep each night. The number 8 is unquestionably significant. It separates easily into 24 halves and has long been associated with sleep, as both Maimonides and Alfred the Great urged. The day was divided into a third for reading, writing, and prayer, a third for handling the realm's affairs, and a third for the refreshment of the body, according to the latter's renowned candle clock. Old ancient doctors of physics say 8 hours of sleep in summer and 9 hours in winter is sufficient for any man. One 16th century physician could write, but I do consider that sleep needs to be taken as the complexion of man is. Individual differences have long been recognized, but it is only recently that the numerical norm has influenced and highlighted our concerns. Not only are we told to sleep for 8 hours, but the figure is now being used to promote the sale of the very mattresses we sleep in. Mattresses have evolved from being anonymous white rectangles to becoming holistic health and wellness machines. As writer John Muallim describes it. No one bothered to remove these clumsy slabs on a regular basis, but we are now required to do it every 8 years. A link of this number with a marketing campaign is based on the conditioning that is a part of falling asleep. The number that signifies a good night's sleep becomes the sign of the proper time to buy a new mattress. Just as preparing for bed because we are weary may mean being tired, because we are preparing for bed. In much of today's sleep science, this type of programming is both deliberately utilized and miraculously overlooked. Books and scholarly publications discuss the obstructive effect of alcohol, for example, and state that drinking before bed compromises rather than ensures a good night's sleep. However, what about the drinker's link with sleep? The impact of this conditioning, which can be significant, is completely overlooked. Yet the same sleep science can then promote cognitive therapies for insomnia that are based on conditioning. Many people benefit from these therapies, which entail connecting particular patterns of behavior with going to sleep. Surprisingly, while hygiene manuals in the 1950s said that everyone needed 8 hours of sleep, popular scientific tomes in the 1960s labeled this a fallacy, and it was widely mocked, with so many factors co-determining onset, amount, and depth of sleep in various individuals. The physician cannot indiscriminately demand of each patient that he go to bed early, fall asleep promptly, or sleep quantitatively by the book, and then translate such expectations into a routinized medicinal regimen, wrote two American sleep writers in 1968. In fact, one could argue that excessive preoccupation with the problem of sleep and its various manifestations is a symptom that affects both the patient and the physician at times, and is, in some respects, as bad as the illness with which it is concerned. The authors are perplexed that anyone can still believe in an 8-hour law, in which every one of us can spend our nights in delightful oblivion, despite the fact that many modern sleep hygienists advise us to do so. Drug companies run advertisements to inform people that they may have a sleep disorder and need medication if they don't get enough sleep, lack the energy to do the things they need to do, such as spend time with their family or perform their job duties, or experience mental tiredness, body fatigue, low motivation, and difficulty concentrating. Aren't these symptoms, as sleep historian Matthew Wolf-Mayer points out, the very conditions of modern life, and indeed, life as it has been lived for centuries? Instead of seeing this as a result of the pressures of modern life, long commutes, and an unbearable exhortation to maintain a positive image during working hours, an advertisement for a mattress company begins by asking viewers if they find themselves unable to concentrate during the day, have problems remembering things, and use a lot of cliches when they speak. It is declared the sign of a poor mattress. In truth, most people in today's urban society fit the criteria of the sleep-deprived human. Human challenges are redefined via the new lens of undisturbed sleep, rather than acknowledging the effects of socioeconomic loads and internal pain. It is because we did not wake up feeling pleased and rejuvenated after a good night's sleep that we forget or fail. King Alfred was on the run from the Vikings and took refuge in the home of a humble peasant in one of the most famous legends of forgetting, after she requested him to keep an eye on the cakes while she went about her errands. His attention wandered, and when she returned, she discovered them completely charred. How long before a sleep apologist claims that the distracted king's inattentiveness was caused by a lack of sleep, as a result of failing to get the 8 hours he had recommended? If he had slept better, he would have fared better and left England without the burnt cake legacy that the bake-offs are still attempting to correct. Sleep deprivation. Sleep science began in the late 1800 seconds, was shattered by World War I, and then expanded throughout the 20th century, with a surge in the 1960s and 1970s. During sleep, electroencephalography, The measuring of electrical potentials in the brain permitted several stages of neural activity to be differentiated, yet no theory could satisfactorily explain what they meant. The widely publicized association between the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, REM, and dreaming in the early 1950s prompted a flurry of new study and funding. But by the early 1980s, dreaming had faded from the public consciousness. The focus would shift away from psychological phenomena and toward what appeared to be purely physical phenomena, with a focus on body clocks, the neurological and neurochemical basis of sleep, and its disorders, and the study and treatment of apnea, or the temporary cessation of breathing while sleeping. Although sleep science is clearly a diverse topic with many different research areas, two characteristics stand out when compared to the early work. To begin with, sleep has become an objectified, external object, moving away from the individual's experience. Today's sleep diaries won't reference patients' words, and people's experiences with designations like insomnia are rarely based on how they describe themselves. The Sleep of Others is the title of historian Kenton Croker's study of sleep research, which emphasizes how sleep was gradually taken away from the person and made into a new artifact that could be manipulated and analyzed without reference to introspection. Second, starting in the late 1920s, sleep research would become a considerably bigger factor in the economy than it had been previously. The goal of research was, and continues to be, to maximize the efficiency and productivity of employees and troops. According to historians, the concept of a single unit of sleep is a very new innovation, dating back only a few hundred years. With the advent of the industrial day in the 1840s, prescriptive concepts of sleep were commandeering, and after the Industrial Revolution, workers were expected to labor for between 12 and 16 hours, with many Western societies eventually settling on the 8-hour workday in the 20th century. Of course, an 8-hour day is a luxury, and the majority of the world's population still works much longer. The statistics for work and rest were set by the needs of industrial schedules and production procedures that the new technologies presented, not by any concern for anyone's well-being. Continuous and unbroken performance became the standard to which employees were expected to aspire. Workers needed enough sleep to function properly in industries like oil and steel, which demand 24-hour output. With the growth of industry, sleep became quantifiable as a supplement to work, and the minimal amount of time required had to be precisely measured. Nathaniel Clayton, widely regarded as one of the 20th century's founding fathers of sleep science, would publish his massive academic book Sleep and Wakefulness in 1939, followed by a synopsis in the popular magazine American Business. His research at the University of Chicago was heavily funded by corporate sponsors eager to engineer more productive workers, and he would even feed Keurig beef to 5-week-old babies after Swift & Co., a local meat company, donated $10,000 to show that they would sleep better on a bovine-filled stomach. Sleep is something that can be manipulated and crafted here, with the goal of enhancing productivity or, in the case of the military, preparing warriors who can stay awake for days on end with the least amount of sleep possible. The U.S. Army used large amounts of amphetamines to keep its men awake during the Vietnam War, and it just launched the Continuous Assisted Performance Project, which aims to eliminate the need for sleep temporarily using medications and electrical stimulators. Many sleep experts are eager to accept a check from such sponsors these days, holding workshops for bank executives on the best methods to rest and get the sleep that less privileged staff and outsourced labor are unlikely to get. Even the most apathetic and well-intentioned sleep research uses optimal performance as a benchmark, as if humans are essentially laborers who must be compelled or allowed to function as productively as possible. You will underperform if you don't get your 8 hours of sleep, failing to complete physical and cognitive tasks that a good night's sleep should have made easier. It's hard to believe that underperformance could be a standard in and of itself. Insomniacs are familiar with the process of extracting sleep from one's own experience. Technicians can show that the 3-hour sleep complained of was actually 5 or 6 hours by monitoring brainwave patterns, respiration, heart rate, eye movement, and muscular activity. Similar differences can be found with home tracking devices, showing that the time spent awake was significantly less than the person expected. But aren't we dealing with two completely distinct eras here? The apparatus does not account for the difference between clock and subjective time. A measuring instrument is unable to capture how long a person is awake. When sleep scientists tell us with a chuckle that insomniacs almost usually overestimate the amount of time they spend awake, they're wrong, since the two measurements at play are incompatible. A person may be led to believe that when they believed they were awake, they were actually asleep due to the high frequency of microarousals during specific stages of sleep. But this is merely a sham. A sleep scientist lacks a device to measure subjective time, which is defined as the time we perceive, in which minutes can feel like hours, and hours can feel like interminable days. The use of scientific-sounding terms like sleep state misperception is merely a sign of this powerlessness. The term sleep does not signify the same thing to an insomniac and a sleep scientist. Over the course of several years, a patient reported his numerous trips to doctors and sleep specialists. When he was finally permitted to spend the night in a sleep lab, he discovered that he was sleeping for about 6 hours and that his fears of an endless night awake were false. However, being told this was ineffective, rather than providing relief, it only added to his anxiousness. It became evident as he recounted his sentiments that what important to him was not just being able to sleep, but also being aware that he wasn't sleeping. He was raised by a single mother, and when she began seeing a man when he was 10, he would stay awake at night, hoping not to hear any sounds of them having sex. Silence was more terrible than any exterior noise in this place, because he expected it to be interrupted at any moment. He would strive to put distance between himself and the hostile ideas that entered his mind as he lay in bed. He would also berate himself for being capable of unpleasant feelings towards someone he was meant to love. When he eventually left home to pursue his education, sleep got easier for him, and the insomnia only surfaced years later when a new girlfriend moved in with him, bringing a son from a prior relationship with her. The triangle of his late youth had been re-established. A man and a woman sleep together in one room, while a child sleeps in another. He was experiencing a painful dilatation of time that was not clock time, not time measured in minutes and hours, but time spent waiting for a sound that would terrify him. He was alone with his thoughts at the moment, alternating between wrath and self-blame. When his mother began her connection, no one appeared to care about how he felt, and no one seemed to recognize the terrible new predicament he was in. Everyone around them was ecstatic, and he felt compelled to share their joy at the new situation. He sought, at some level, authentication of his sentiments, of what it had been like to lie there in that unending midnight limbo in his consultations all those years afterwards. Those disciplines that place a premium on listening rather than measuring have never come up with a comprehensive explanation for sleeping disorders. In talking treatments, sleeplessness is rarely the initial reason for consultation, though sleep problems frequently emerge afterwards. In the case at hand, I didn't find out about them until we'd been working together for a few months. Given the agonies of insomnia, one might wonder why this is the case. Is it simply a matter of having the correct pointers to be able to talk about it? Or may there be a purpose in this avoidance? Sleep problems in children are more visible, owing to the fact that, in most situations, it is the parents who are awakened when their child is unable to sleep, and it is they, not the child, who seek treatment. We frequently discover that a child's sleep is obstructed by a preoccupation with mortality or the body? How can I sleep if I might never wake up? They ask, having recently learned that death is like a long sleep. Even in the early 20th century, a frequent children's bedtime prayer included the sentence, "If I should die before I wake." When nappies are no longer used, the worry of soiling the bedclothes may hinder sleep. Bedwetting, which was formerly thought to be the most common childhood sleep disturbance, may now be associated with a secondary pathology. The princess in the Pea fairy tale is a nice example of this type of precise and transient sleep disturbance. Due to the pea placed beneath her beds, the protagonist is unable to go asleep correctly, proving that she is a true princess. However, there is no doubt that beneath the story lies a sexual awakening narrative. The little pea-shaped thing keeps her awake at night, and sleep will come when the joy of feeling it, or the guilt that this causes, is processed in some way. The story does, in fact, end with the pea's marriage to a prince, which gives rise to the notion that a husband may take the place of the pea. Traumatic events of any kind can keep a youngster up at night, preventing them from sleeping. Even when her mother ran to her and hugged her, a 4-year-old girl would sit straight upright in bed screaming and pulling at her arms. The crisis continues beyond the moment of waking in these night terrors, which are typical in early life, and no comfort from the caregiver registers for several minutes, as if they are still trapped in their trauma even though their eyes are wide open. The cause of the sleep disturbance appeared to be evident in this case. The girl had been admitted to the hospital 2 years prior in an emergency, and staff had attempted to forcefully implant a cannula into both of her arms while she screamed in pain. She reappeared later in the night terror, attempting to rip the cannulas from her grip. In later life, such instances of timely and exact sleep interruptions are more the exception than the rule. They usually resolve quickly in children, with or without therapeutic intervention. However, they can be more refractory when the parent's fears are compounded with the child's. It is typical for a parent to check on their sleeping infant to ensure that they are not dead, even if the child is far past their first year of life. Similarly, bedclothes may be meticulously examined for any signs of effluvia or body deposit, as though the parent's personal fear of stains and dirt cannot be separated. Yet, as the youngster develops new ways of expanding the problems that preoccupy them, we find that the child's sleep symptoms improve with time. Playing, reading, painting, daydreaming, and chatting are all possible ways to represent and inscribe the fears and anxieties that accompany sleep. Bedtime rituals arise in the 2nd and 3rd years, as if the kid inserts repetitive and sequential behaviors at the maximum moment of psychological and physiological weakness, the transition between waking and sleeping. In adults, sleeplessness is more complicated, although there are instances where its abrupt onset is clearly connected to a single cause that can then be investigated. When it is a chronic problem, numerous causes are usually at play. Any diverse issues are encapsulated in what appears to be a single symptom. Direct techniques are frequently ineffective in this situation, and when the insomnia diminishes, physicians report that it is the result of a retrospective perception rather than an immediate illumination or understanding. One day, the patient will claim that, curiously enough, they are sleeping much better now. The relationship between the onset of the insomnia and the new domestic triangle was critical in the instance we mentioned earlier, and it led to an investigation into the patient's past. But it did not result in a miraculous change in his sleeping problems. This would come much later, as he wrestled with the issue of his biological father's relationship with him. He'd only met him a few times before, and he'd always agreed with his mother in her judgment of what appeared to be a cruel and indifferent guy. He had the option to visit his father when he learned he was dying of a fatal disease, but he declined. However, after his death, he began to question his decision. Was his mother correct? Didn't he owe a duty to this man, who had been one half of the reason why I exist? After all, His insomnia's horrible nighttime environment would feel like a punishment, as if he had to pay a price for his carelessness. What the example clearly demonstrates is how various factors are at play in the sleeping problem. Insomnia was triggered, in some ways, by his childhood experience of remaining awake at night, fearfully listening for sounds of his mother and her lover. But it would later take on a new purpose. It had become a matrix of many sorts of grief, doubt, and sadness as a container for his self-accusations and the harms they caused. In today's society, when conventional views of sleep are favored, sensitivity to these particular, distinct reasons of insomnia is becoming increasingly difficult. We're told how much sleep we need, but we're also informed what's keeping us from sleeping. From the blue light from our laptops to our bad sleep scheduling to the caffeine we consume. Some of this information, as well as some of the proposed therapies, is undoubtedly beneficial. But we miss out on the story of individual lives and how this might shed light on the roots of each person's sleep problems. This has gained a new sheen in the last decade or so, although the primary focus of sleep research remains productivity and efficacy. The impacts of sleep loss on body health are becoming increasingly important. Inadequate sleep is now being linked to cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and endocrine disorders, with lack of sleep being dubbed the silent killer that heart disease previously was. Some of these arguments are compelling, and the science is compelling. But what's fascinating here is how health can be readily superimposed on the older imperatives to be productive. Existence is now just as much a task or product of our efficiency as work used to be. Staying alive is now considered as a personal choice, a duty we must consistently work at. Therefore, existing is now just as much a chore or product of our efficiency as work used to be. You must be as productive as possible, and you must stay alive as long as possible are becoming increasingly synonymous. As a result, the distinction between health and illness becomes increasingly blurred, so that avoiding illness and staying alive takes on moral significance. When a sleep hygienist claims that getting enough sleep will keep you slim, reduce food cravings, protect you from cancer and dementia, reduce your risk of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes, and make you happier, more honest, yes, seriously, and less anxious, they add that the best part is that it's all for free. However, it is only possibly free if you are not like more than 95% of the world's population, who must fight to make a living, work long hours, worry about their loved ones and employers' demands, and obtain access to basic facilities. Many sleep hygienists give advice that is only for the wealthy, where each person has their own bedroom with sensitive temperature control and software that tailors the environment to their unique circadian rhythm, waking them to artificial bursts of blue light that make them happier and more hopeful in the morning, while putting pressure on impoverished people to sleep like the wealthy improve their sleep. It may appear to be wonderful news that Aetna, a U.S. insurance behemoth with nearly 50,000 employees, provides them a bonus for obtaining more sleep, based on a sleep tracker they can wear. But this ignores the human costs of not receiving a bonus, as well as the constraints such reward systems impose. What is being introduced here, if not the pressure to sleep more, to earn as much as one's colleagues, and to be monitored even at night by one's employer. If you're having difficulties sleeping, don't worry. If your sleep tracker classifies you as an insomniac, you might be able to receive cognitive therapy via your smartphone to help you sleep better. Some sleep scientists suggest sleep breathalyzers in cars, which would prevent you from driving if a scanner detected you hadn't gotten enough sleep. If 1 in every 2 persons does not receive the recommended amount of sleep, this might have a significant impact on global pollution, but it ignores the wrath and frustration that someone would feel if their automobile refused to start. Although sleepiness is a factor in many traffic accidents, it would be foolish to disregard the violence that automobile deprivation may produce, especially when considering what a car means to its owner. We might also take a moment to consider the epidemiological evidence linking the hour shift. When the clocks moved forward in the spring to a large rise in car accidents on Monday morning the following week. Are these, after all, direct impacts of exhaustion, and hence poor vehicle control owing to the loss of an hour of sleep? Or, on the other hand, heightened rage, impatience, and annoyance as the person wakes up late or feels robbed of valuable sleep time? The human experience of changing the clocks must undoubtedly be factored into the calculation. Do you prefer 1 or 2 nights of sleep? The emphasis on performance and productivity that today governs sleep is frequently assumed to have supplanted the day-night cycles that apparently organized society before the Industrial Revolution. This is also the point at which 2 different types of time were split from one another. Time became currency during the Industrial Revolution, according to social historian E.P. Thompson. Thompson believed that the labor pattern had shifted away from limiting tasks and toward time itself, which could not be wasted as it had in the pre-industrial age. There was now a distinction between the time of the worker and the time of the master, and humans no longer shared one and the same time. Workers' downtime was a master's lost time. When the worker was away from the workplace, this was the master's time, a division that the worker would internalize. The expansion of timekeeping gadgets, as well as public clocks, would emphasize uniform working hours and the monitorization of time. The time of industry, of fledgling but imperfect capitalism, meant that the clocks changed. This was less about the loss of 1 hour in summertime, which many countries accepted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, than about the loss of an entire manner of experiencing time itself. Aren't we dealing with a form of this division of time when we tell today's insomniac that they overestimate their time awake? There are 2 times here, one dominating and right, the other left to the whims of human perception. After all, this is a conflict between 2 discourses, 2 ways of seeing and being in the world. It is the difference between the time of the slave and the time of the master, however we like to gloss it, whether as an uneducated and misinformed patient or a mature and reasonable sleep specialist. We must keep the master's time in order to function well in society. The separation of 2 periods has often served as a symbol of social and political differences. Walter Benjamin quotes a poem on the July Revolution in Paris in his Arcades project. Who would believe it? Divided by latter-day Joshuas at the foot of every clock tower. Divided by we're firing on clock faces to make the day stand still. It is told. The authors include a note claiming that this was a unique element of the insurgency, claiming that it was the only act of vandalism committed by the people against public monuments. What a heinous act. How accurately it describes the state of hearts and thoughts on the evening of the 28th. This behavior was noticed at the same hour in different sections of the city, and so could not be regarded as an isolated whim, but a widespread, practically general emotion, according to the report. Circadian rhythms, which are regulated by internal body clocks that run along an approximately 24-hour cycle, are also documented by some sleep science. External cues known as zeitgebers, such as light, temperature, and social interaction, assist set or entrain the circadian cycle, which is why night shift employment and flying between time zones may be so detrimental to our sleep. When we look at graphs of circadian peaks and slumps throughout the day and night, we see that human life is frequently split between working and sleeping, as if no other time exists or is possible. The French adage métro, boulot, dodo, tube, work, sleep denotes a lifeless, mechanized lifestyle, and this is exactly what the graphs of circadian rhythm imply. with no recording of napping habits or variations in sleep patterns. For example, factory owners, of course, instituted the split of the day into labor and sleep, and one wonders how such results would translate to the more complex realities of a human day. After all, it's usual to strive to make extra time, particularly through the use of pharmacological transitions, such as a drink to mark the end of a workday or the liminal time that so many of us introduce to border sleep, often staying up longer, and later merely to do so. A patient described how she would construct this private space in the wee hours of the morning, rather than late at night. She would get out of bed at 3 a.m., write in her journal, eat a snack, and read before going back to bed and waking up at 7:30 a.m. with her flatmates, who were completely oblivious of her routine. She felt fulfilled by their ignorance, as if she had created a parallel existence, a moment that belonged to no one else. To use her phrase, the more we live on other people's time, with their schedules and responsibilities, the more essential this lure to alone time becomes. And once it is created, it can become home to a range of activities that have taken on a new meaning. These hours may be at odds with our sleep, wake cycle's circadian rhythms, just as they are with late capitalism's sleep requirements. The discovery of circadian rhythms was inherently compatible with the modern marketplace, as it demonstrated that the body has its own sequencing that was not solely based on the sun's rising and setting. This signified a split between the individual and the social body, echoed in the distinction between the rhythm itself, wholly endogenous, and the environmental cues, the zeitgebers, that helped set it and implied a disconnection between the person and the social body. According to historians, circadian rhythms shifted slightly in the 19th century, owing to the ubiquitous presence of artificial illumination. As a result, the body was vulnerable to external intervention, and we can see how the language we use to describe our relationship with technology has come to apply to ourselves. Our biology can bear said like a clock or a meter. Surprisingly, the wake-sleep cycle appears to be the most well-known physiological rhythm here, despite the fact that hundreds of bodily functions oscillate between maximal and minimal values throughout the day, and recent research has revealed that almost every cell in the body uses some form of timekeeping. The market's intrusion into sleep time was unavoidable, logically speaking. It made no sense that something that was meant to take up a third of a person's life could go unmonetized, and the old tradition of selling sleep treatments and potions would become enormous business in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Companies in the tech, pharmaceutical, and mattress industries have all spent a lot of money on marketing campaigns. New algorithms and sleep tracking gadgets promise to quantify sleep and its quality, and we are encouraged to be just as concerned about our nighttime activities as we are about our daytime activities. Sleep teaching gadgets, which repeated words and information that the worker could master while slumbering, were formerly widely promoted when sleep was related with memory consolidation, which we will discuss later. The issue of monitoring and surveillance is typically viewed as benign in this context, allowing us to control and better ourselves. Some of the new mattresses include built-in technology that collects data on the user's sleep and, in many cases, follows the market's size-value equation. The new mattresses include double, triple, and quadruple layers of foam and fabric, just like a Big Mac is better than a regular burger, whereas the multiplication of beds is a strange and conspicuous aspect of a royal lineage test in the fairy tale. It has now become the supersized prerequisite for a good night's sleep. From the early 19th century forward, not only did the amount of time given to sleep become more and more regimented, but so did the type of sleep itself. The historian Roger Eckerch maintained in an influential series of papers and a book at day's close that biphasic sleep was the most basic type of human sleep prior to this period. Humans had a first and then a second sleep, rather than a single unified block. They would retire at 9 or 10 p.m., sleep until midnight or 1 a.m., then rise for an hour or two, described as watching, which meant less viewing than being awake, before returning to Thersican sleep until morning. Although the starting timings for the first and second sleeps varied historically and geographically, the biphasic pattern remained fairly consistent. Varied cultures and times would have different interpretations of this sleep divide, just as the activities to occupy the time between the two sleeps would differ. Sex, embroidery, cooking, dream reflection, and a variety of other interstitial practices are examples. However, variations of this distinction between first and second sleep would unavoidably appear from culture to culture and region to region. People in some societies were expected to sleep on their right side for the first night and on their left for the second, giving origin to the phrase "got out on the wrong side." This basic biology had been undone in a few hundred years. By the mid-19th century, allusions to the two sleeps had faded, and consolidated sleep had become the norm. Eckhart initially attributed this to the rise of artificial lighting, which would eventually replace the oil lamps that had appeared on city streets in the 17th century with gas, and subsequently electric lights. Because of technology advancements, not only could stores and companies stay open later, but a whole new nighttime society could arise. Historians have tracked this amazing transformation of city life, which would push back the first and only sleep border. Artificial lighting brought up new options, challenging previously held beliefs about light and dark, and encouraging and facilitating later bedtimes. Due to nocturnal activities, the century between 1730 and 1830 was a pivotal period for shifting bedtimes. In 1736, London had 5,000 oil lamps and 40,000 gas lamps by 1823, whereas Paris had only 200 gas lights in 1835, and over 13,000 4 years later. The lamps were dubbed police lamps rather than street lights, emphasizing the connection between light and safety. But the concept of surveillance functioned in more ways than one. This was also the time when new behaviors, such as peering into other people's homes after dark, were possible. Whereas a simple gas light could give about 12 times as much light as an oil lamp or candle, the electric bulbs that appeared towards the end of the 19th century were around 100 times brighter. Beyond the gatherings and balls that the new culture accelerated, a far more broad and fundamental process of transformation was at work. Because of new lighting technologies, shops and companies could stay open well after dark. The less fortunate would often work later. If sleep had taken on a spiritual connotation for ages as a time of purification and relaxation, these ideals were about to be lost. Sleep became less of a precious and maybe personal place for renewal as the Industrial Revolution progressed, and more of a period that meant progressively not being at work. These social and economic factors were added to Eckart's theory of the reasons of biphasic sleep loss, and they were not restricted to the growth and refinement of urban lights. Shifts in how work was perceived, the advent of shift work and scheduling, new technologies and their impact on manufacturing processes, the concept of time management, and concepts of a work ethic suited to industrial capitalism all contributed to the change to the consolidated sleep paradigm. It appeared to Eckert that a natural biological process was being distorted by human social development. It appeared that Eckert had found biological validation of his thesis when he learned of sleep researcher Thomas Ware's investigations at the National Institute of Mental Health. Ware had removed his participants from modern life's artificial light, dark separators, and discovered that many of them slept in 2 segments rather than 1. In the winter, he sought to replicate the day, Night cycled by having his volunteers spend 14-hour blocks in a dark chamber after 10 hours of exposure to light. They would wake for 2 to 3 hours after midnight, just like Eckert's pre-industrial populace, before falling asleep again. The loss of extended artificial light, which Eckert had identified as the principal cause in his historical investigations, seemed to coincide naturally with the onset of wakefulness or watching. It appeared that consolidated sleep was a creation of the Industrial Revolution, and biphasic sleep was the human body's natural cycle. These claims are now causing some debate. It seems evident that dividing sleep into 2 stages was a common aspect of human experience until the 19th century in many societies. But whether the body will revert to it if exposed to artificial light is less certain. Other researchers have had more equivocal results. Albeit the sleep patterns they discovered almost all tended to be interrupted intervals of sleep, as Weyer's experiments seem to corroborate. Much of this study, on the other hand, is based on a fantasy, the belief that isolating the human body is the best method to discover its natural state. A person is cut off from the social body in order to find the original, primal cycle of sleep. They're locked away in a cave, an underground bunker, or a special sleep lab, with technologies monitoring their activity cycles, temperature, hormone levels, and other factors. Although this may reveal some important findings about environmental cues to physiological processes, it does not tell us much about natural sleep, given that humans live next to or close to one another. And it is precisely this proximity that may have powerful effects in shaping sleep. As we shall see, if an infant sleeps with its mother, nearly every major characteristic in sleep physiology is affected, from neurochemical concentrations to the quantity of deep sleep and respiratory behavior. The trials attempting to intentionally remove the sleeper are reminiscent of Louis II's seclusion of infants from human language in order to determine whether their first words were in Hebrew or Latin. It's a fallacy to think of language and sleep as apart from social interactions. We may have to learn to sleep, just as we must learn to speak. Instead of merely sleeping, we are put to sleep as children, and then we must put ourselves to sleep in increasingly intricate ways as adults. Turning off the lights. The account of our transition from natural biphasic sleep to a single block of consolidated sleep fits in nicely with current yearning for a more natural world in which humans lived in harmony with nature. However, things are not as straightforward as they appear. Thompson's picture of a task-oriented, agrarian community may have been wishful thinking, and he certainly overestimated the importance of timekeeping in the early modern world. Hald Lenny and Nigel Thrift show how daily life was packed with temporal indicators well before the industrial age began in their thorough study of timekeeping in late medieval and early modern England. The developing postal and transit networks, as well as religious houses, schools, markets, guilds, and sporting activities, all involved noting times of day. Coach hire was, in fact, charged by the hour rather than by the mile. Similarly, the concept of an agricultural community ruled solely by the day-night cycle is dubious. Workers may well wake up at 3 a.m. to finish harvesting by late morning in such societies, which do not set their clocks only by sunrise and sunset. Some crops are difficult to process after midday, when their leaves become sticky and unruly, whereas others are impossible to harvest at morning due to moisture. When we imagine the happy agricultural worker being awoken by the cock's crow at sunrise, working in the fields, and then sleeping soundly, we should keep in mind that cocks crow several times throughout the night, marking different dawns, and that at the end of the day, many other forms of work would be required, from treating crops and making repairs to spinning, preparing food, and cleaning. Hundreds of years ago, before the invention of artificial lights, work would continue well after the sun had set. This is not to minimize the influence of industrialization, artificial lighting, and early capitalism's new work ethics, all of which had an impact on how people saw time. But rather to cast doubt on the idea of an earlier agrarian harmony dictated by the day-night cycle. Capitalism, according to the critic Jonathan Crary, is incompatible with the axial rotation of the planet. But neither was pre-capitalism. In some regions of the world, the day-night cycle was likely more essential at the time than it was afterwards. But humans have always been divorced from their environments, inventing their own artificial measures, hierarchies, and prohibitions to regulate their relationships with their surroundings. Even the most basic aspects of seasonal variation show that clock time and timekeeping techniques have never been completely in sync with day-night cycles. The fact that a real 24-hour day happens only 4 times a year drew little attention as time grew more standardized. The elliptical orbit of the Earth, its varying speed as it travels around the sun, and the fact that it draws closer to the sun at different times of the year were all overshadowed by the mechanical clock's homogeneity. Although timekeeping has a long history, and clocks predate the Industrial Revolution, it was arguably the 19th century's telegraphy and railroad communications systems that established the dominance of the new timekeeping with their promise of ever faster connectivity that established the dominance of the new timekeeping. Local solar times were superseded by time zones and national mean times, which is why we speak of current times, because the sun crossed the meridian at noon in solar time. Different sites had varied timings depending on their longitudinal position. Around 75 railway times were in use in the United States by the mid-1870s, with multiple times typically displayed inside the same city. Court and railroad clocks were frequently set to separate times on the same street, resulting in parallel times. Officials in Germany proposed giving station clocks 2 hands, one for local time and the other for railway time. A practice followed in France, but with 2 clocks, one inside and one outside the station, and some even having a 3rd clock set to Paris time. When Henry Ford was only a poor handyman mending jewelry and watches, he had the notion of manufacturing a wristwatch with 2 dials, one for local sun time and the other for standard railroad time, as if geographical isolation had to be ignored in order for commerce to move forward. This ingenious innovation must have seemed like a novelty at the time. It was quite a curiosity in the neighborhood, Ford says, but today, rather than being worn on the wrist, it's as if the 2 clocks have been internalized. Our production must please several masters, which means the clock never stops ticking. As Crary puts out, we've moved past the old distinction between on and off. Today's marketplace, and indeed our personal lives, have no actual state of rest. So breaks must be artificially manufactured and paid for. Sleep started to occupy a spectrum between, on the one hand, the bare minimum required to allow ongoing production of commodities, and, on the other hand, a principle of sacrifice for the greater good. As a result of industrialization and new frameworks to organize and regulate employees' lives, many companies and employees believe that sleep should be sacrificed in order to maintain a strong work ethic. Early to bed and early to rise, a British proverb popularized by Benjamin Franklin, could be likened to the Chinese aphorism, late to bed and early to rise. The impacts of the 24-hour clock, which differs from solar time, would determine how early and late were measured, rather than the day-night cycle. This is nowhere more evident than in modern China, which, despite its enormous size, eliminated all 5 of its prior time zones in 1949 in favor of a single standard Chinese time. The one-of-a-kind Beijing time was a symbol of national unification, demonstrating how time can be used for political purposes. Individual lives are, of course, the victims in this situation. When we phone a service provider in the evening and speak with someone in India or Asia, we may assume that the call is being outsourced because our evening is their morning. In terms of worldwide time differences, outsourcing makes sense. However, in many cases, the person on the other end of the line is a night shift worker who is staying up late to serve a more powerful economy and earn the little that they are paid there. Local economics are connected with more strong overseas economies, and the body's need for sleep is regarded as secondary in this mismatch, even though they are well aware of the harmful impacts of shift employment. Several sleep clinics outsource this method, sending data overseas. The straplines of two well-known Wall Street films nicely represent this constant profit-making activity. Every dream has a price, the banners said in 1987, implying the moral destitution that accompanied financial gluttony. The strapline for the 2014 sequel was Money Never Sleeps, shifting the focus away from any moral concern and toward a simple statement of the market's reality. Money takes up all of one's life if sleep is expected to take up around a third of one's life. And it is this invasion of the body, as much as the colonization of time, that capitalism entails. If money never sleeps, the breaks and interruptions of daily life are either ignored or commodified in and of themselves. A cup of coffee, a bar of chocolate, or, until recently, a cigarette are all associated with the amount of time spent enjoying them. This time must be paid for, but not just by purchasing the commodity in question. We now fill it with work, checking our phones and computers, and multitasking in general. Any genuine pause becomes improbable, and the destruction of our day's structure is mirrored not just in the loss of biphasic sleep, but also in the absence of the customary daytime nap. Anthropologists and sociologists have recorded how these behaviors are fading, from the Spanish siesta to the Japanese inamuri. In 2006, the Spanish government voted to prohibit napping in the workplace and civil service and government agencies, while in Japan, daytime sleep in settings as diverse as meetings and parties is becoming increasingly frowned upon, and in many instances is prohibited. Lunchtime sleeping is likewise prohibited in China, which was established a part of the Constitution in 1950, with break time reduced from 3 hours to just 1. The market is the underlying rationale here, because human time is profit, and napping reduces productivity and efficiency. Money never sleeps, and neither do its human slaves, who are denied the stops and breaks that used to be a part of daily life. Interestingly, despite the fact that sleep hygienists have often stated that workplace napping might boost productivity, many attempts to adopt this practice in the West have failed. Dedicated locations such as workplace sleep pods in specific sleep zones, with dim lights and leafy plants, have been experimented with by companies such as Pepsi, IBM, and Pizza Hut. Popular books like Sleep for Success and The Art of Napping at Work tout the virtues of taking a sleep at work and anticipate that it will become a regular part of the working day. Despite the positive rhetoric, many of these businesses have failed, and companies that were founded to sell sleeping places to huge organizations have gone out of business. After all, not only is it difficult to shift established sleeping habits, but also to exercise the never-ending demands that occupy the normal working day. One of them may be the requirement to take a nap right now. The irony is that both sleep and sleep deprivation serve the same master: increased economic output. There is a clear and troubling message contradiction here. On the one hand, we live in a non-sleeping world of business and information, and on the other, we are increasingly advised to get the recommended amount of hours of restful sleep. Of course, the two are incompatible, but there is a lot of money to be earned in the gap created by these opposing imperatives. Professionals can help you retrain your sleep patterns, and pharmaceutical businesses can sell you medications to help you do so, instead of acknowledging the impossibility of reconciling imperatives. It becomes the core principle of marketization. Yet, if we are meant to be in a constant state of arousal, How can we return to what is claimed to be the old pattern of sleep and wakefulness? As we sleep, our phones, computers, and other electronic devices continue to rack up demands, and several new apps promise to safeguard us. They promise to make us unreachable, blocking messages and demands. As a result, we must utilize our phones and computers to defend ourselves from our phones and computers. That involves remembering to set the app, verify it, and monitor it in the same way that it apparently monitors us. Each object in the bunny's home is named and then bid farewell in the bedtime classic goodnight mood. Written in 1947 and still a favorite today. A telephone, a red balloon, a toy house, a young mouse, 2 kittens, and a pair of mittens. The symmetry of naming each piece and then saying goodbye to it is undoubtedly soothing. But it's worth noting that the telephone is the only item in the inventory that doesn't get a good night. The smartphones and tablets that now sit on our nightstands magnify this connection to external demands, allowing us to receive not only phone calls, but also texts, emails, and all sorts of social media conversations and feeds. The surveys that appear to contradict this are, in their own way, indicative. When asked if they feel more interpellated by work demands via their computers and smartphones after working hours have officially ended, many people say they do not, and that they are perfectly capable of switching off. However, this clearly reflects a second element of our era, the temptation to act as if everything is fine, which contrasts sharply with earlier periods in the 20th century, when it was acceptable, even expected, to signal that things were not fine. Irving Goffman distinguished everyday social space from that of total institutions such as prisons and asylums in his brilliant exposition of looping. We might register affronts to our sense of self in everyday professional life, he claimed, by using face-saving response expressions like sullenness, failure to defer, lack of excitement, negative asides, scowling, irony expressions, and so on. However, the agencies that develop these defensive measures then target them as the next target of assault in whole institutions. The inmate is unable to create any distance between himself and his humiliating predicament, as the methods he would use to do so have now become further grounds for punishment. But more importantly, beyond the issue of a real penalty, the scowl or snarky remark is used to characterize the individual rather than their reaction to their terrible predicament. The signals of an individual's disaffiliation are now viewed as signs of their affiliation. As Goffman puts it, tearing up a mattress or writing with feces on the cell wall are not considered as legitimate methods if an asylum inmate finds himself or herself in solitary, naked and with no obvious means of expression. The less a person can speak up for themselves, the more their efforts will be exploited to characterize them as deserving of punishment. Staff are frequently overworked and unable to document anything other than acts of defiance. Today, we are undoubtedly witnessing the expansion of what Goffman identified as a feature of prisons and asylums to all social areas, where negativity is viewed as a symptom of sickness, expressions of withdrawal or unhappiness. In other words, valid reactions to one's situation become crushed back into the situation through the looping process. We must be enthusiastic and focused in all of our undertakings and endeavors, pretending joy for boring, pointless jobs and friendship for hated coworkers and colleagues. The constant pressure to both self-evaluate and be assessed tops it all off. Isn't this exactly what so many insomniacs say? That while they lie in bed, the question, "How did I do today?" plagues them, keeping complexity at bay. It's easy to speculate that the loss of Goffman's spaces, where we can define a distance from the pressures placed on us, will lead to a quest for another area to do so, perhaps the very border between waking and sleeping. All the scowls, withdrawals, and asides we failed to make can be imagined as we lie awake, as can the actions of vengeance and payback required to maintain our dignity. As author Chloe Origes puts it, thoughts that projected a peaceful glow during the day have suddenly become radioactive. The complete institution is still present, even in the solitude of our mattresses. I'm simply lying there for hours, going over the day again and again, asking myself, what have I achieved? Again and again and again, one of my patients explained. And, of course, the question of what has been accomplished quickly morphs into the issue of what went wrong today. Almost every conversation now includes a request for input, as if human behavior is simply something that can be improved and improved. We frequently hear that artificial intelligence poses a serious challenge in this area, that robots are on the verge of becoming more and more human-like, and that new risks and threats will emerge as a result. Isn't it, however, the other way around? When one examines AI research from the late 1940s and 1950s, it becomes clear that everyone is attempting to find a mechanism for robots to be able to not only do an operation, but also to question, how did I do, as a vital step. After that, they must apply the critique into their succeeding performance. What was once considered an ideal machine function has now become the standard for everyday human life. Servomechanisms developed during WWII intended to imitate goal-directed behavior, whereas classical machines dealt with engine metabolism. That is, the translation of one kind of energy into another, a comparison of their own performance to a predetermined condition, known as a feedback loop, would become an input. As a result, the service system would be responding not only to the outside world, but also to its own response to the outside world. This was tremendously beneficial for target-seeking missiles, but it amounted to a gradual assimilation of humans to machines rather than machines to us. Artificial machine technology and AI language, such as feedback, has transferred from machines to people, requiring us to embody the operations that they were designed to replicate. In this weird reversal, it is the humans, not the machines, who spend their days wondering how well they have performed. What can I do to improve? What are my advantages and disadvantages? These were the kinds of questions that early service systems were designed to ponder. And, like these robots and their more advanced successors, we are now always on, with fewer and fewer opportunities to return to a world where off means anything. Even on television variety shows, we no longer merely watch singers, dancers, and entertainers. We also observe the performers, as well as a jury that sits in judgment of them. In effect, we are seeing a performance appraisal, with the question, how have I performed, converted into entertainment. But the agony and disappointment of individuals engaged can be seen beneath the forced grins. We're not just watching someone perform, we're hearing them sing, and then judging them. Shows like The Apprentice reenact this, with the main attraction being the roughness and violence with which tasks are judged. The fact that a real 24-hour day happens only 4 times a year drew little attention as time grew more standardized. The elliptical orbit of the Earth, its varying speed as it travels around the sun, and the fact that it draws closer to the sun at different times of the year were all overshadowed by the mechanical clock's homogeneity. Although timekeeping has a long history, and clocks predate the Industrial Revolution, it was arguably the 19th century's telegraphy and railroad communications systems that established the dominance of the new timekeeping, with their promise of ever faster connectivity that established the dominance of the new timekeeping. Local solar times were superseded by time zones and national mean times, which is why we speak of current times, because the sun crossed the meridian at noon in solar time. Different sites had varied timings depending on their longitudinal position. Around 75 railway times were in use in the United States by the mid-1870s, with multiple times typically displayed inside the same city. Court and railroad clocks were frequently set to separate times on the same street, resulting in parallel times. Officials in Germany proposed giving station clocks two hands, one for local time and the other for railway time. A practice followed in France, with two clocks, one inside and one outside the station, and some even having a third clock set to Paris time. When Henry Ford was only a poor handyman mending jewelry and watches, he had the notion of manufacturing a wristwatch with two dials, one for local sun time and the other for standard railroad time, as if geographical isolation had to be ignored in order for commerce to move forward. This ingenious innovation must have seemed like a novelty at the time. It was quite a curiosity in the neighborhood, Ford says, but today, rather than being worn on the wrist, it's as if the two clocks have been internalized. Our production must please several masters, which means the clock never stops ticking. As Crary puts out, we've moved past the old distinction between on and off. Today's marketplace, and indeed our personal lives, have no actual state of rest. So breaks must be artificially manufactured and paid for. Sleep started to occupy a spectrum between, on the one hand, the bare minimum required to allow ongoing production of commodities, and, on the other hand, a principle of sacrifice for the greater good. As a result of industrialization and new frameworks to organize and regulate employees' lives, many companies and employees believe that sleep should be sacrificed in order to maintain a strong work ethic. Early to bed and early to rise, a British proverb popularized by Benjamin Franklin, could be likened to the Chinese aphorism, late to bed and early to rise. The impacts of the 24-hour clock, which differs from solar time, would determine how early and late were measured, rather than the day-night cycle. This is nowhere more evident than in modern China, which, despite its enormous size, eliminated all 5 of its prior time zones in 1949 in favor of a single standard Chinese time. The one-of-a-kind Beijing time was a symbol of national unification, demonstrating how time can be used for political purposes. Individual lives are, of course, the victims in this situation. When we phone a service provider in the evening and speak with someone in India or Asia, we may assume that the call is being outsourced because our evening is their morning. In terms of worldwide time differences, outsourcing makes sense. However, in many cases, the person on the other end of the line is a night shift worker who is staying up late to serve a more powerful economy and earn the little that they are paid there. Local economics are connected with more strong overseas economies, and the body's need for sleep is regarded as secondary in this mismatch, even though they are well aware of the harmful impacts of shift employment. Several sleep clinics outsource this method, sending data overseas. The straplines of 2 well-known Wall Street films nicely represent this constant profit-making activity. Every dream has a price, the banners said in 1987, implying the moral destitution that accompanied financial gluttony. The strapline for the 2014 sequel was Money Never Sleeps, shifting the focus away from any moral concern and toward a simple statement of the market's reality. Money takes up all of one's life if sleep is expected to take up around 1/3 of one's life. And it is this invasion of the body, as much as the colonization of time, that capitalism entails. If money never sleeps, the breaks and interruptions of daily life are either ignored or commodified in and of themselves. A cup of coffee, a bar of chocolate, or, until recently, a cigarette are all associated with the amount of time spent enjoying them. This time must be paid for, but not just by purchasing the commodity in question. We now fill it with work, checking our phones and computers, and multitasking in general. Any genuine pause becomes improbable. And the destruction of our day's structure is mirrored not just in the loss of biphasic sleep, but also in the absence of the customary daytime nap. Anthropologists and sociologists have recorded how these behaviors are fading, from the Spanish siesta to the Japanese inamuri. In 2006, The Spanish government voted to prohibit napping in the workplace in civil service and government agencies, while in Japan, daytime sleep in settings as diverse as meetings and parties is becoming increasingly frowned upon, and in many instances is prohibited. Lunchtime sleeping is likewise prohibited in China, which was established a part of the Constitution in 1950, with break time reduced from 3 hours to just 1. The market is the underlying rationale here, because human time is profit, and napping reduces productivity and efficiency. Money never sleeps, and neither do its human slaves, who are denied the stops and breaks that used to be a part of daily life. Interestingly, despite the fact that sleep hygienists have often stated that workplace napping might boost productivity, many attempts to adopt this practice in the West have failed. Dedicated locations such as workplace sleep pods in specific sleep zones, with dim lights and leafy plants, have been experimented with by companies such as Pepsi, IBM, and Pizza Hut. Popular books like Sleep for Success and The Art of Napping at Work tout the virtues of taking a sleep at work and anticipate that it will become a regular part of the working day. Despite the positive rhetoric, many of these businesses have failed, and companies that were founded to sell sleeping places to huge organizations have gone out of business. After all, not only is it difficult to shift established sleeping habits, but also to exercise the never-ending demands that occupy the normal working day. One of them may be the requirement to take a nap right now. The irony is that both sleep and sleep deprivation serve the same master: increased economic output. There is a clear and troubling message contradiction here. On the one hand, we live in a non-sleeping world of business and information, and on the other, we are increasingly advised to get the recommended amount of hours of restful sleep. Of course, the two are incompatible, but there is a lot of money to be earned in the gap created by these opposing imperatives. Professionals can help you retrain your sleep patterns, and pharmaceutical businesses can sell you medications to help you do so, instead of acknowledging the impossibility of reconciling imperatives. It becomes the core principle of marketization. Yet, if we are meant to be in a constant state of arousal, how can we return to what is claimed to be the old pattern of sleep and wakefulness? As we sleep, our phones, computers, and other electronic devices continue to rack up demands, and several new apps promise to safeguard us. They promise to make us unreachable, blocking messages and demands. As a result, we must utilize our phones and computers to defend ourselves from our phones and computers. That involves remembering to set the app, verify it, and monitor it in the same way that it apparently monitors us. Each object in the bunny's home is named and then bid farewell in the bedtime classic Goodnight Moon. Written in 1947 and still a favorite today. A telephone, a red balloon, a toy house, a young mouse, 2 kittens, and a pair of mittens. The symmetry of naming each piece and then saying goodbye to it is undoubtedly soothing. But it's worth noting that the telephone is the only item in the inventory that doesn't get a good night. The smartphones and tablets that now sit on our nightstands magnify this connection to external demands, allowing us to receive not only phone calls, but also texts, emails, and all sorts of social media conversations and feeds. The surveys that appear to contradict this are, in their own way, indicative. When asked if they feel more interpellated by work demands via their computers and smartphones after working hours have officially ended, many people say they do not, and that they are perfectly capable of switching off. However, this clearly reflects a second element of our era: the temptation to act as if everything is fine, which contrasts sharply with earlier periods in the 20th century, when it was acceptable, even expected, to signal that things were not fine. Irving Goffman distinguished everyday social space from that of total institutions such as prisons and asylums in his brilliant exposition of looping. We might register affronts to our sense of self in everyday professional life. He claimed, by using face-saving response expressions like sullenness, failure to defer, lack of excitement, negative asides, scowling, irony expressions, and so on. However, the agencies that develop these defensive measures then target them as the next target of assault in whole institutions. The inmate is unable to create any distance between himself and his humiliating predicament, as the methods he would use to do so have now become further grounds for punishment. But, more importantly, beyond the issue of a real penalty, the scowl or snarky remark is used to characterize the individual rather than their reaction to their terrible predicament. The signals of an individual's disaffiliation are now viewed as signs of their affiliation. As Goffman puts it, tearing up a mattress or writing with feces on the cell wall are not considered as legitimate methods if an asylum inmate finds himself or herself in solitary, naked and with no obvious means of expression. Unless a person can speak up for themselves, the more their efforts will be exploited to characterize them as deserving of punishment. Staff are frequently overworked and unable to document anything other than acts of defiance. Today, we are undoubtedly witnessing the expansion of what Goffman identified as a feature of prisons and asylums to all social areas, where negativity is viewed as a symptom of sickness, expressions of withdrawal or unhappiness. In other words, valid reactions to one's situation become crushed back into the situation through the looping process. We must be enthusiastic and focused in all of our undertakings and endeavors, pretending joy for boring, pointless jobs and friendship for hated coworkers and colleagues. A constant pressure to both self-evaluate and be assessed tops it all off. Isn't this exactly what so many insomniacs say? That while they lie in bed, the question, "How did I do today?" plagues them, keeping complexity at bay. It's easy to speculate that the loss of Goffman's spaces, where we can define a distance from the pressures placed on us, will lead to a quest for another area to do so, perhaps the very border between waking and sleeping. All the scowls, withdrawals, and asides we failed to make can be imagined as we lie awake, as can the actions of vengeance and payback required to maintain our dignity. As author Chloe Origes puts it, thoughts that projected a peaceful glow during the day have suddenly become radioactive. The complete institution is still present, even in the solitude of our mattresses. I'm simply lying there for hours, going over the day again and again, asking myself, what have I achieved? Again and again and again, one of my patients explained. And, of course, the question of what has been accomplished quickly morphs into the issue of what went wrong today. Almost every conversation now includes a request for input, as if human behavior is simply something that can be improved and improved. We frequently hear that artificial intelligence poses a serious challenge in this area, that robots are on the verge of becoming more and more human-like, and that new risks and threats will emerge as a result. Isn't it, however, the other way around? When one examines AI research from the late 1940s and 1950s, it becomes clear that everyone is attempting to find a mechanism for robots to be able to not only do an operation, but also to question, "How did I do?" is a vital step. After that, they must apply the critique into their succeeding performance. What was once considered an ideal machine function has now become the standard for everyday human life. Servofunctionisms developed during WWII intended to imitate goal-directed behavior, whereas classical machines dealt with engine metabolism. That is, the translation of one kind of energy into another, a comparison of their own performance to a predetermined condition, known as a feedback loop, would become an input. As a result, the service system would be responding not only to the outside world, but also to its own response to the outside world. This was tremendously beneficial for target-seeking missiles, but it amounted to a gradual assimilation of humans to machines rather than machines to us. Artificial machine technology and AI language, such as feedback, has transferred from machines to people, requiring us to embody the operations that they were designed to replicate. In this weird reversal, it is the humans, not the machines, who spend their days wondering how well they have performed. What can I do to improve? What are my advantages and disadvantages? These were the kinds of questions that early service systems were designed to ponder. And, like these robots and their more advanced successors, we are now always on, with fewer and fewer opportunities to return to a world where off means anything. Even on television variety shows, we no longer merely watch singers, dancers, and entertainers. We also observe the performers, as well as a jury that sits in judgment of them. In effect, we are seeing a performance appraisal, with the question, how have I performed, converted into entertainment. But the agony and disappointment of individuals engaged can be seen beneath the forced grins. We're not just watching someone perform, we're hearing them sing, and then judging them. Shows like The Apprentice reenact this, with the main attraction being the roughness and violence with which tasks are judged. Like the robots, it's no longer enough to simply execute things. It's also necessary to ask, could I have done better? Surprisingly, instead of settling into the job or profession that the first reality show promised them, the winners frequently appear on a second and then a third reality show. If you win The Apprentice, you'll be eligible for Celebrity Big Brother and, with luck, Dancing on Ice. It's as if the new vocation of these characters is to be constantly seen and scrutinized, evaluated at all times by fresh judges and audiences as they're passed around from show to show. Their job entails little more than being judged in public. These shows are also signs of the demise of conventional authority figures in modern society. Father figures of all kinds are reduced from Jehovah-type lawgivers to helpless clowns, according to social theorists, which means that the desire to resuscitate them is common, as legal and social forces work to limit, or at least try to limit, the unfettered exercise of patriarchal authority. A hole is created that, rather than creating space for new parity, may favor the re-establishment of an imbalance, as the authority figure becomes increasingly susceptible to the law, unable to wield power without adequate regulation and external sanction. He emerges as entertainment on the TV show, degrading and belittling participants, acting on his own whims with no regard for anyone's well-being or dignity. All the media decries irrational authority. This is what people want to see, a type of repression disguised as a variety program. The weird twist in this logic was seen in Donald Trump's election in the United States. This was a man who owes a lot of his fame to a TV show called The Apprentice, in which he played the exact role of authority, and caprice turned into amusement. However, many people were perplexed when he went on to become president. The weird sense of unreality felt by millions of Americans testified to the reversal of a psychical process. This was in stark contrast to the election of Ronald Reagan, an actor who later became president. People might find this amusing or repulsive, but not truly uncanny, as Trump did when he took on the duty for which his public persona on The Apprentice had served as symptomatic compensation. Future visions that depict a seamless integration of human existence and technology are both true and incorrect in this case. There is no question that AI will continue to infiltrate ordinary life and human services, and there is also no doubt that this will not fit, that there will be a fracture or fundamental flaw between humans and machines. A doctor, for example, will never truly be replaced by AI. But this will not prevent investment in the replacement of many medical services. But the key is to understand that what this means isn't some type of enlightenment in which we realize what robots can and can't accomplish. but rather an ever-increasing pressure on us to become machines. If we are unhappy with an AI doctor, it is our responsibility to change. Not the AI doctors. We'll have to start acting more, and more like anything an AI doctor can help with. Many of these developments are mirrored in the sleep literature. When you compare scientific and popular publications from the 1960s and 1970s to those from today, you'll notice a significant difference. The earlier studies appear sober and humane, acknowledging life's challenges, whereas much of the new sleep science assumes that we live in a fantasy world in which people can live rich, full, and satisfied lives once they solve their sleep problem, which is usually caused by purely external factors that can be changed through behavioral change. I always ask the baristas if they woke up happy and refreshed, looking forward to the day ahead when I get my morning coffee. We all laugh at the absurdity of the idea, but it is the assumption of a fulfilled existence that underpins most of modern sleep hygiene. Whereas Ernest Hartman's seminal 1978 book The Sleeping Pill declares on the first page that to a certain extent life is pain and sorrow. Matthew Walker's 2017 book Why We Sleep extols man as a kind of champion among animals, superior to all other beasts, whose sleep grants him unique powers of rationality and creativity. REM sleep, about which more later, aided man's rapid evolutionary rise to power and formation of the globally dominant social superclass. Sleep recalibrates our emotional brain circuits, helping us to negotiate next-day social and psychological issues with cool-headed calm, according to Walker, allowing us to have a level-headed ability to understand the social environment around us. Whereas the opening phrase of Gay Luce in Julius Segal's best-selling 1969 book Insomnia reads, "There is only one sure way to escape insomnia, not to be born. There is no room for human fracture and dislocation in more modern sleep literature. Today, we can read that sleep assisted us in becoming emotionally astute, stable, strongly linked, and intensely sociable groups of humans. A diagnosis that does not match what I see on the news or learn from world history. The rising pressures to sell ideas and to cover up the reality of human life, along with Goffman's looping effect, imply that we are compelled to speak in a well-being speak, exhibiting perpetual positivity and enthusiasm. There must be something wrong with you if you don't have a smile on your face, as evidenced by the prevalence of emojis in everyday life. The complexity of true emotions has become so undesirable in today's society that cartoon caricatures have literally taken their place, not only in texting and emails, but also in many of the disciplines that pretend to be scientific. All naive Darwinian conceptions of emotion were deconstructed and demonstrated to be catastrophically insufficient in the 1920s and 1930s. Nowadays, these same views are employed as templates in scientific investigations. According to an old 19th century notion, there were 6 to 9 primary emotions, each of which was linked to unique physiological expressions that could be found in any culture. Anger, joy, and disgust were all real emotions that were expressed unmistakably through the human face. Anthropologists and psychiatrists, on the other hand, pointed out that expressions were socially determined and linked to expectations and assumptions specific to the human group in question, and thus were socially determined and linked to expectations and assumptions specific to the human group in question. Isolating someone and then filming their facial expressions will not reveal any deeper reality, because we all internalize the social structures in which we grow up. Even when we are alone, we wear masks. A patient is shown a picture of a happy or angry face on a brain scanner, and the resulting trail of blood oxygenation is taken to reflect the state of happiness or wrath. The cues can be more complex, images or words that have been deemed disturbing or pleasant, but the structure remains largely unchanged. Here, Facial expression is associated with a set of intrinsic emotions that are tied to our evolutionary past. What people experience is tied to some external qualities that are supposed to represent virtue or badness, rather than the specificity of their own history. This is analogous to the world of emojis, in which complex human emotions are reduced to discrete particles that can be neatly separated. This is how I feel, says the emoji. But real life, not to mention world literature, and arguably the entirety of human culture, demonstrates that emotions cannot be compartmentalized in this way and can metamorphosis and blur into one another. Attraction and revulsion can easily become equal, just as fear and want can fluctuate and become the poles of an equation. Sadness and wrath are the same thing for me. There's no difference. One analyst and adds, fear becomes sexual desire, says another. On the death of a parent, another adds, I feel both devastated and emancipated. So, which of the emojis should she choose? Emotions are part of social behavior, according to anthropologists, and are both experienced and made meaningful by our interactions and relationships with others, as well as organized by cultural conventions of expression. As the historian of affect Ruth Lays points out, Olympic gold medalists make a variety of facial expressions during the medal ceremony, but only smile when interacting with the audience and officials, demonstrating that the smile is not a natural pre-programmed response indexing an underlying emotion, but rather a socially determined response. Why are we returning to ideas that have been debunked for a long time? It connects with Lay's modern desire to read people through their body language, as though a facial expression is a printout of a discrete psychological state. The core reality of a person can then be accessed by properly trained observers through the act of reading, as though this were independent of any ideology or meaning. Emotions themselves become commodities that require exact distinction and price, commodities that may be localized and separated from one another. I was teaching at a university in Paris in the early 1990s. Just as Disneyland was ready to open, the park approached us to offer part-time jobs to kids whose main responsibilities were to smile and greet tourists as they passed by. If this cheerful expression was once purchased, it is now simply expected of all of us. What was formerly considered a remunerated piece of theater is now considered standard practice in practically all human operations. Academic psychology of the 20th and now 21st centuries provided an underpinning as market-based societies increasingly practiced atomization of the social group, so that citizens became individuals who were seen as isolated economic units in competition with one another for goods and services. The human subject was defined by one-dimensional instrumental goals: the pursuit of riches, happiness, success, and health, rather than as a member of a social group with collective responsibilities and duties. Whereas the human mind has been marked by conflict for ages, between reason and emotion, will and education, the ego and the unconscious, it now appears that the soul is conflict-free, seeking only for one basic and unambiguous purpose. Compare and contrast the sleep literature of the 1960s and today. The individual who lies awake at night is no different from the person who struggles during the day. According to Luce and Segel, the same personality that loved and loathed, smiled or grieved, and swerved from tranquility to anxiety. However, there is no conflict in the minds of many modern sleep hygienists. According to the book, life is ruled by two simple laws that regulate the majority of human and animal behavior: avoiding something that will make you feel awful, or attempting to accomplish something that would make you feel good. In the 21st century, this is referred to as science. We are taught that the emotions that drive this law are what motivate us to try again when we fail, keep us safe from danger, motivate us to achieve gratifying and positive outcomes, and impel us to build social and romantic relationships. In this bizarre one-dimensional society, it appears that Star Wars is about the only place where anyone can still recognize that we may strive for conflicting things, both success and failure, money and poverty, health and sickness. The franchise is based on the premise that we all have something special within us that is just waiting to be discovered, which is presented here as the force that we can uncover within ourselves. But more importantly, the stories focus around those pivotal times when a character is torn between competing allegiances, between the Force and the dark side, as though the conflict will never be resolved, and the very core of our being is a terrifying war between opposing tendencies. The need to sleep clashed with the want to have insomnia diagnosed and acknowledged in the situation we considered earlier. We risk overlooking the substance of the person's troubles if we concentrate solely on one of these currents. As a result, we lose the opportunity to assist them in moving forward. Human beings are split in various ways, and what appears to be a contradiction or a paradox is ignored at our peril. Not sleeping can be a source of anguish, but it can also have a purpose, such as enacting a punishment, as we'll see, or serving as a plea for some other form of pain to be recognized. What is the definition of sleep? Although artificial illumination, changes associated with capitalism and new work ethics influenced how sleep was perceived. By the late 19th century, a two-part biphasic sleep was considered troublesome, whereas waking up in the middle of the night had not been a cause for concern or panic for generations. It had now become pathologized as an oddity. Medical textbooks and lay self-help books both cautioned against the hazards of waking up in the middle of the night, and treatments and drugs were extensively promoted. In the early 1930s, when psychotherapist Francis Derry met with a young medical student who complained of a lack of attention while studying, there was no mention of sleep problems. He casually commented, "I wake from hours 2 to 3, after several months," as if he assumed everyone had a wake hour. When Derry questioned this, he began to offer a sort of lecture about the fact that everyone, whether a good sleeper or a lousy sleeper, had one certain hour of the night during which he did not sleep. He'd go to bed at 10 or 11 o'clock, sleep well until 2 o'clock, then wake for an hour with no animosity or effort to return to sleep, before drifting off until 7 o'clock. It was not easy to persuade him of the symptomatic nature of his wake hour. Derry says, "What makes the story so interesting is that the patient's depiction of his nightly pattern matches the authentic structure of human sleep as defined by historians and anthropologists. The only problem was that it had beyond its sociological expiration date by a few decades. The analyst tries to persuade him that his sleep pattern is abnormal, that it is a symptom that requires treatment. But all he is doing is following his ancestors' biphasic sleep pattern. What would have gone unnoticed 60 years before had become an indication of disease by the 1930s. We can observe how our ideas of what sleep should be impact our perceptions of what is abnormal or sick. Perhaps Derry's patient was merely following a long-established human sleep pattern, but once consolidated sleep became the norm, biphasic sleep became an issue. Even in a time when many people believe that consolidated sleep is the natural state of sleep, new pathologies are created every time the latest opinion about sleep is turned into a fact. Experts may say 8 hours 1 minute and 7 the next, just as some of the breathing peculiarities of sleep may seem peripheral one moment and signs of disease the next. In late 19th century dictionaries, the term insomnia began to appear, with a medical meaning beyond the generic sense of restlessness that it had previously carried, and the back pages of newspapers and journals were crowded with advertisements for sleep-inducing remedies. A restful night was promised by powders, ointments, potions, and plasters, whereas troubles falling asleep were more typically mentioned before the mid to late 1800 seconds. Waking up during the night was now regarded the main issue. Eckarch claims that throughout these years, There was a gradual conflation of the inability to fall asleep with a new emphasis on the inability to stay asleep, which was frequently related to the constraints of modern living in both medical and lay books. Reports of the principal markets are published every day, and our consumers are constantly posted by telegram. A New York businessman may grumble in the late 1860s. He was thus kept in constant excitement, with no time for peace or repose, arriving home maybe after a long day of hard work and excitement, to a late dinner, attempting to forget business among the family circle when he is interrupted by a telegraph from London. Sleeplessness has been much of late, noted another insomnia observer in the 1880s, attributed to the practical annihilation of time and space by our telegraphs and railroads, the compressing of months' labors into hours or even minutes, the tremendous competition in all kinds of business made possible and inevitable, intense mental activity engendered in the mad race for fame and wealth, where the nervous and mental force of man is measured against steam and lightning. The rush and excitement of modern life is fairly accurately regarded to be accountable for most of the insomnia of which we hear. According to an article on sleeplessness in the British Medical Journal in 1894, the chronic fear of insomnia was related to new technologies that compacted space and time in ways that are startlingly similar to those used today. If the concept of a single night's uninterrupted sleep was created by the Industrial Revolution in many ways, the concept of what disturbs our sleep and how to fix it was also shaped by social development. By the early 21st century, we had firmly established a shift in how we see sleep issues. If worry and stress are still recognized as causes of insomnia, lack of sleep is now being utilized to explain these very fears. The damage caused by sleep disorders appears to be unlimited, as more and more human problems are observed through the prism of sleep disorders, whereas depression was formerly related to grief or suppressed wrath, then to a chemical imbalance in the brain. It is now commonly attributed to a lack of sleep. Is everything here relative, though? If what we expect from sleep influences how we think about and categorize sleep disorders, is there a true and unchanging number of hours that humans require? Or is it solely depend on cultural imperatives? To say that sleep is biological or social is to misunderstand the point, because the two cannot be differentiated in any absolute sense. Although these imperatives have certainly evolved over time, it is also true that individuals have always suffered from a lack of sleep, even if the ways in which this suffering has been expressed and understood has varied. This may be true when sleep historians point to the rise of sleep pathology in the 19th century and link it to the development of factory labor, artificial lighting, and the modern market. But the focus on medical publications diverts attention away from a much older tradition that attests to the persistent problems people faced at night. If we look to cookbooks rather than medical texts, we may find that for millennia, dishes have been recommended to help people sleep or soothe nighttime tension. There would inevitably be those to put one to sleep strewn throughout the home recipes. But what really is sleep in this situation? Many sleep remedies, according to writer Georgie Byng, entail focusing on an inert, calm image or relaxing process, as if we need to trick or fool ourselves into sleep. A calm blue sea or a green field are conjured up to drown out the ideas that keep us awake, or they are simply what wakefulness is made out of. The fact that accessing sleep requires some mental gymnastics shows that it isn't a natural condition, and that if we have to deceive ourselves to get it, sleep and the self are incompatible. Similarly, once we have it, it can readily vanish. Surprisingly, sleep researchers claim to have only lately come up with a solution to the mystery of why humans sleep, despite the fact that there have always been many theories. Biology texts from the late 1800 seconds to the late 1900 seconds could still say that sleep was a mystery. When it comes to breathing, a pretty straightforward explanation. intake oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. This is not the case with sleep. What exactly does it perform if its purpose is entirely physiological? And if it's psychological, what's the point? Sleep, like a battery, appears to be the mechanism that permits the organism to recharge. It would be a natural state that occurs as a result of human activity and is triggered by fatigue or exhaustion. Nonetheless, practically everyone who has studied sleep in depth has shunned such ideas. Those who remain inactive may sleep the same amount, if not more, as those who participate in sports all day. Therefore, there is no clear link between exercise and sleep. Sleep, according to Swiss psychologist Eduard Klappert, is a defense against exhaustion rather than a result of it. And several investigations have demonstrated that people may have difficulties falling asleep if they are kept awake for a long time. But there be as much insomnia if sleep was only possible because of exhaustion. The idea that we need to re-energize or conserve valuable energy is compounded by the fact that, as we'll see, we're actually quite active at night, and the amount of energy we save by getting a good night's sleep is roughly equivalent to one glass of wine, 80 to 130 calories. Although our metabolism slows and our temperature, heart rate, and pulse decrease, the impact on energy saving is not as significant as we might assume. Even the brain's energy requirements are unaffected. Cerebral oxygen use falls by only 2.8%. However, no one here seriously questions the importance of sleep, circadian and other rhythmic mechanisms, as well as the accumulation and depletion of specific substances in the body, obviously push us towards sleep. Sleep deprivation has been used to find an explanation. If you can figure out what occurs when a human being, or, more commonly, a cat or a rat, is deprived of sleep, you can figure out what the functions of sleep are. Again, this has sparked some intriguing research with some very important medical consequences. But its larger logic is open to question. If someone begins to hallucinate or dies as a result of a lack of sleep, does it follow that the purpose of sleep is to prevent us from hallucinating or dying? Or, if it's true that lack of sleep impairs our ability to kill, is sleep there to allow us to do so? On the other hand, learning that immune function and tissue regeneration are enhanced during sleep, and that sleep deprivation will limit the body's ability to fight illness, may appear to be a more compelling teleology. Why are you sleeping instead of resting here? What is the nature of sleep and what is meant to take place during it? A common story goes that sleep was thought to be a passive state for centuries, until the development of human electroencephalography, EEG, in the late 1920s, which allowed researchers to study the electrical activity of the brain while sleeping, and rapid eye movement sleep, REM, in the early 1950s, which was considered a game changer in sleep science. Electrodes put on the scalp recorded electrical potential variations, which are indicative of brain activity in specific locations. The image of brain waves was formed by measuring these potentials over a predetermined period of time, which indicated significant change throughout the nighttime hours. It was evident that the brain was quite active at night, and that REM sleep EEG measurements strangely matched those of the waking state. Many scholars have recommended that REM periods should not be labeled sleep at all, instead being referred to as paradoxical sleep, archai sleep, fast sleep, active sleep, or dreaming sleep. The EEG readings during the REM periods suggested that the person was awake in certain ways, even though they were clearly asleep. Their eyes were closed, and their bodies appeared to be mostly inert and unresponsive to stimuli. These were dubbed the rapid eye movement periods by Eugene Aserinsky, who studied under Nathaniel Klateman at the University of Chicago. He had preferred jerky eye movement because he was impressed by their jerkiness and the fact that they were slower than eye movements in waking life. But he decided against it because jerk is associated with masturbation. It became a question of sleep, wakefulness, and REM sleep, a transitory condition between waking and sleeping that many experts believed was considerably closer to awake than to sleep. On REM sleep, NREM has been split into 5, 4, and most recently 3 stages, with the relationships between these states being investigated. We have low amplitude but high frequency waves when we are awake, with the latter being used to signify how alert or vigilant we are. The higher frequencies drop when we get weary, and we're left with alpha rhythms, the slower waves that characterize a drowsy condition. The wave's amplitude will increase now, and we'll transition from the alpha rhythm of relaxed waking to stage 1 NREM. This is usually considered a transitional stage, with some researchers requiring the absence of alpha rhythms, but most agreeing that less than 50% alpha activity is acceptable. This decision is complicated by the fact that, according to sleep researcher Ian Oswald, about 10% of the population does not display alpha rhythms in the first place. Slower frequency theta waves are present, sometimes associated to mindless, repetitive work, and it is during this phase that we can experience abrupt jerks, which can occasionally wake us awake and be perplexing. If we do wake up during this period of sleep, we may be struck by vivid visual and oral visions known as hypnagogic events, which we will discuss later. Stage 2 NREM, which lasts 45 to 50 minutes, is characterized by low amplitude waves with spindling, which are ripples of considerably rapid activity, and K-complexes, which are short, sharp waves that might cause awakening and a return to alpha rhythm. A K-complex can emerge following stimulation of any sense modality, but it can also be habituated. Thus, a sound that creates a K-complex at first will have no effect after a few repetitions. The fact that a K-complex can be triggered by hearing one's own name while sleeping implies that it is a partial arousal that responds to significant stimuli. While many researchers feel that it actually suppresses acoustic and other distractions, allowing for unbroken sleep. Stages 3 and 4 are known as deep or slow wave sleep, and it's interesting to see how contemporary methods have reduced them to just one stage. It's unclear whether this reduction is a step forward or a means of avoiding concerns that must be explained. Slow delta waves with occasional spindling characterize stages 3 and 4, with delta waves exceeding 50% in stage 4 and ranging between 20% and 50% in stage 3. Stage 4 was once thought to be a brief phase of deep sleep with little spindling and no K-complexes. Following these NREM stages, the brain returns to stage 2 before entering the REM stage, which is marked by bursts of rapid eye movement, loss of muscular tone, a low amplitude EEG that resembles awake, and irregular breathing and heart rate. This can last anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour or more, increasing in length as the night progresses, and accounting for between 20 and 25% of the night's sleep, though it accounts for around 50% for newborns. It can be disrupted by stage 2 NREM, and it's worth noting that a specific amount of time must pass between each REM session. The cycle will then begin again, with an average time of 90 to 100 minutes for the entire run from stage 1 to the conclusion of the REM period, and perhaps 30 transitions between stages during an average 7-hour sleep. And REM stage 1 will appear momentarily after the first REM period, followed by stage 2, although the presence of stages 3 and 4 will be greatly reduced later in the night. These periods of profound slow-wave sleep occur primarily in the early hours of the night, and it's unclear why they're so rare. Those who sleep for 6 to 8 hours at a time will have 4 or 5 NREM, REM cycles per night, with the initial REM state usually being extremely brief, followed by a period of slow-wave sleep. The following REM will last longer, and the cycles here tend to be 90 minutes long. The length of the cycle in newborns is shorter, averaging 60 minutes and growing to roughly 75 minutes by 2 years. While it is unlikely that the earliest REM is comparable to that of later children and adults, twitches, smiles, grimaces, sucking motions, and eye and limb movements characterize this stage of sleep, which is also known as active sleep or precursor REM. In contrast, their quiet sleep has less movement, and eye activity, more uniform breathing, and a slower EEG, albeit readings are often less useful than direct observation. Another surprising fact is that babies can enter sleep through precursor REM, but this is no longer possible as they get older, and NREM marks the start of sleep. NREM appears to be a later stage of development than REM, occurring between the ages of 3 and 5 months. In addition to eye movement, REM sleep was marked by bodily motion and irregular heart and breathing rates. When people were awakened from REM sleep, they had a far higher rate of dream recall than when they were awakened from NREM sleep. This sparked a lot of interest, and by the mid-1960s, dream research had garnered a whopping 5% of the National Institute of Mental Health's funding. Numerous trials revealed that stimuli such as noise and light could be registered during sleep, even if the person had no conscious memory of them, as researchers investigated what medical and psychological purpose dreaming might have. Even if the person continued to sleep through it, their blood pressure could rise considerably as a result of external noise. These insights about sleep meant that it could no longer be thought of as a passive escape from the world that occurred automatically when we closed the curtains and turned off the television. The work of Horace Magoun and Giuseppe Moruzzi on the active suppression of the reticular development during sleep, published in the late 1940s, was considered as proof of nocturnal activity. This section of the brain stem connects sensory pathways with fibers from higher brain centers, and by adding its own activity, it may be able to impact changes in waking and sleeping behavior irrespective of external cues. As a result, the brain was highly busy controlling and producing both sleep and awakening. But probably the most important finding here was not that sleep had multiple phases with different EEG tracings, which had long been known, but that there was an actual periodicity involved. Aserinsky discovered that every hourly motility cycle of infants included a period of roughly 20 minutes when ocular movements were considerably inhibited in his early research. He'd then compare this to adult REM periods, which lasted about the same amount of time, and likewise lowered muscle tension. He never explained why this unusual echo occurred, but he did demonstrate how REM cycles occurred at precise times during the night. It was the regularity that was important. Aserinsky's eye movement recording papers, which he worked on all night, may be up to half a mile long. The REM state would only come once the previous sleep stages had been completed, and would then appear every 90 minutes throughout the night. This was a stage of sleep that occurred on a near-cyclic basis, and had EEG features that were distinct from both waking and sleeping. There was, and still is, some debate about why NREM and REM were sequenced in the way they were. What purpose did these various stages serve? What role did dreaming have in their lives? This story, like most scientific discoveries, turns to be more complicated. The concept of sleep as a highly active state was well known in the 19th century, especially among European sleep experts, and rapid eye movement was scarcely groundbreaking. The finding of rapid eye movements during sleep in the early 1950s, according to Dement, was the breakthrough, the revelation that revolutionized the trajectory of sleep study, although it was a phenomenon that had been described centuries before and researched professionally for at least 30 years. Similarly, the notion that before the breakthrough, everyone thought of sleep as a passive condition of rest is false. When Sigmund Freud published his interpretation of dreams in 1899, the entire book was based on the premise that sleep is a state that must be both produced and sustained. It was more of a case of I make myself sleep than of I fall asleep. And Freud spent hundreds of pages explaining and analyzing the psyche as nocturnal activity, as well as examining the previous research. Many of the theories that we see today in the pages of neuroscience journals were developed by German sleep researchers, but this history has been largely forgotten, owing to a combination of post-war antipathy to German scholarship and the fact that later researchers couldn't understand the language. The notion that Ig sleep studies had to wait for the REM breakthrough is also false. In 1943, the young Dr. Zelda Teplitz published an important and underappreciated review of Ig sleep and dream investigations. Sleep Ig was not a novel occurrence, and Ig was becoming more widely recognized as a valuable tool. A revelation in the 1930s that epilepsy was tied to a 3-second spike in wave pattern reinforced faith in electrical recordings, and this would subsequently confirm the assumption that specific functions, or lack thereof, may be linked to the sleep stages delineated by Ig. Brainwave readings were represented in newspapers, movies, and on television, not simply in scholarly journals. Ig data was thought to correspond with states of mind, and in one well-publicized experiment, the investigator anticipated that the subject, a reporter, was double-checking his answer to a mathematical problem based on an Ig reading. After being hooked up to the machine, he was told to rest until the Ig revealed alpha rhythm, then focus on the math problem. He left alpha to think about the problem, returned, and then left again, at which point the experimenter remarked to his coworkers that the subject must be checking through. The naive enthusiasm expressed by such theater is extremely similar to that which is displayed now when neuroscience findings are promoted as providing the processes of cognitive or emotional parts of our lives. Although it is now completely forgotten, Ig was formerly used to assess personality types and even love compatibility in a manner that is almost analogous to how brain imagery is so frequently invoked in the modern world. Colorful depictions of brains lighting up, which appear in scientific publications and the media, are rarely direct representations of what they are purported to convey, just as brain waves cannot be taken seriously as representing specific ideas or personality traits. The multicolored brains are statistical maps, not photographs, and the brain WESI is an image made using a statistical template, not the actual brain of the experiment subject. This type of functional brain mapping is sometimes mistaken for a snapshot, similar to an X-ray, despite the fact that the technologies are vastly different. Functional brain scanning, unlike a camera, is not a real-time or optical technology, but instead relies on software assumptions about the brain to create images. This is not to dismiss the value of scanning techniques. Rather, it is to acknowledge that the image presented as a factual depiction of a single brain process is actually a representation of a set of statistical values. We may be captivated by the vibrant colors in the scan images, as though they represent separate processes. But the use of color has been controversial, as it appears to categorize quantitative differences. The patterns of blood oxygenation in the brain that such images track are only loosely connected with neuronal activity, and identifying them definitively with specific mental processes is a huge and steep step. Scanning techniques have been part of commercial and ostensibly scientific endeavors to discover facts about human attachment, emotion, religious belief, and memory as a result of the hunger for science to answer the difficulties of human existence. Experiments deliberately compress complex parts of human existence to brief laboratory-based encounters. Watching a cartoon, listening to a list of words, looking at images, since scanning requires a subject who is immobile, limited, and concentrated on a simple job. During such tasks, some areas of the brain are judged active, reifying what are plainly socially manufactured categories, such as the day's mental condition or the emotion that the researcher needs to explore to further their career. The recent demonization of fake news unfortunately feeds into this worldview. The ostensibly liberal and enlightened gesture of distinguishing false propaganda from real hard news has, in fact, served to divert attention away from the fact that, as historians, sociologists, and anthropologists have demonstrated for over 140 years, the visibility accorded to any news item is influenced by social and economic factors. What gets aired and broadcast will be determined by a complicated series of decisions and choices, and the facts themselves will be infused with cultural values and meanings. Some occurrences, such as a death or a volcanic eruption in Hawaii, may appear to be simply genuine, but when, how much, and if they are reported, they introduce precisely these values. Any people with little interest in how facts actually come about took to the streets in the aftermath of the fake news media storm to try to persuade the public to reinvigorate their trust in science as an antidote to false news, rather than encouraging people to question their faith in experts and explore what is socially constructed within science, as Galileo, Newton, and Marie Curie did. It simply posits another belief system, which in this case included many doctrines derived from the most reactionary forms of 19th century reductionism. Instead of informing yourself on how such visuals are constructed and what assumptions are embedded inside them, believe the colored pictures of brains, memory, and sleep. The news of REM's discovery in the early 1950s was undoubtedly billed as such, with the popular press and media pushing the Chicago study's findings. Despite the fact that Kleitman and Aserinsky were credited with the work, it did not appear out of nowhere. In reality, Aserinsky would subsequently allege that Kleitman was only interested in monitoring from afar. But whatever the details of this priority conflict, it was Soviet, not American, research that had focused on the periodic cycles of human sleep as early as the 1920s. Despite the fact that Kleitman, who could read Russian, gives an abbreviated citation of one of these sources, it is never cited from or properly acknowledged, possibly due to the egos of people involved as well as the Cold War, during which much of this work was done. During sleep, the Russian research clearly discerns periodic cycles in which respiration and heart rate become erratic, and eye movement becomes rapid, along with the other motor phenomena that Kleitman and Aserinsky would study. So there has been a notice and interest in sleep periodicities for several decades prior. What's remarkable about these historical questions is that one of the most influential and powerful explanations of sleep is that it helps people remember things better. At the end of the 19th century, it was widely accepted that sleep involved a certain consolidation of memories, and memory was regarded as a rich and complex phenomenon. Sleep was viewed as a technique of shifting from short to long-term memory by organizing and integrating new experiences and ideas received throughout the day. Rather than distinguishing between recall, reminiscence, and memory, as philosophers and psychologists had done, memory had been increasingly conflated with word retrieval by the 21st century. Subjects are given word or task lists before going to sleep and then being tested when they wake up, obstructing REM or NREM sleep, fractioning the amount of sleep, and so on are some of the variations, and there have been many diverse and inventive experimental designs here. Regardless of the distinctions between declarative and non-declarative memory, the assumption that human memory can be reduced to, or at least modeled by, recall of words and behavioral sequences, or, as some academics put it, packets of information, remains consistent. For many sleep experts, this is critical since evolution depends on our ability to learn new truths that could be crucial to our survival. As a result, sleep consolidation serves an evolutionary purpose. Of course, you can't put someone's brain under a scanner, but you can make them learn a list of words. An electrical current is seen to move back and fourth between the hippocampus, which is a short-term memory store location, and the bigger storage site of the cortex in a well-known experiment. This was moving fact-based memories from the temporary storage depot, the hippocampus, to a long-term secure vault, the cortex. We're informed definitely. Participants awakened with a restored capacity to absorb new information within the hippocampus, having transferred yesterday's imprinted experience to a more permanent safe hold. According to the study, this was fantastic news, as it meant that the process of acquiring new facts could resume. Apart from the utterly unscientific recasting of hypotheses as facts, it's hard not to recognize another fantasy here, in which life is all about keeping things tidy and emptying out messy and overfilled containers. The brain activity is linked to cleaning and neurological sanitation, as well as the ease with which critical documents can be found on a properly organized, clutter-free desk. Although there is little evidence that the hippocampus has storage problems or needs to empty itself, it is claimed that before they slept, the subjects were fetching memories from the short-term storage site, whereas after sleep, the memories had moved, because the same information was now being retrieved from the neocortex, where the memories were now safely living. We're persuaded that sleep was future-proofing those memories. The hippocampus is cleansed away and made ready for new imprinting of data, as this happens on a daily basis. When psychologists and neuroscientists examine behavior, it's interesting how often their visions of human life are of a test or a maze, learning bits of information and then being tested, sometimes with a verdict on the horizon, or watching rats navigate a labyrinth are used as models for practically all purposeful human behavior, with a gloss on reward-seeking circuits in the brain. The concept that human life could be anything other than an exam or a maze seems absurd, and we might conclude that the objective of human evolution in this scenario is to win a pub quiz. It's important remembering that for centuries, tests were about the art of disputation rather than recall, and that the maze fascination lay in the point of death at its center. One of the most common fallacies regarding human learning processes, as memory historian Jocelyn Small points out, is that they include verbatim recollection. Instead, she demonstrates that they were mostly about theme remembrance, with little emphasis on accurate formal recall, as many early 20th century memory studies likewise indicated. A poet is not expected to reproduce a previous work word for word, but rather to recite it theme by theme. Yet, in sleep and memory research, this fantasy, that life or memory is about accumulating new data, dominates, muting any actual approach to the richness of the phenomena being researched. We may contrast this with our own experience, in which much of human existence demonstrates how people do not learn anything, and instead repeatedly make the same awful mistakes. Should we tell them that something is wrong with their brain, or that they aren't sleeping well, and so aren't retaining new information? Women have often seen how certain guys will spend their life looking for new information while simultaneously forgetting about everything that could be referred to as a relationship. It's a shame that such a fascinating discipline as sleep research has become chained to the impoverished fantasies of a few male researchers, that the public's desire for science is so strong that it may easily succeed in obstructing other traditions and viewpoints. At the early 1960s, academics were warning of the impending collapse of proper retention and recall research, a reductionism that effectively redefined memory as a retrieval and storage mechanism for little packets of information, for storing facts that we need for survival. This may be compared to the entirety of world literature. A memory, according to the Bront sisters, Proust, Homer, and Dickinson, is not an object that can be lost and found, but rather something that can permeate and texture every part of existence. Memory, according to the classical and Renaissance ideas of memory researched by Small and Francis Yates, is a kind of architectural place that we live in, whereas memory is something that is, on the contrary, inside us. Memory blurs the lines between what appears to be internal and external space, making such distinctions even more difficult. Wills begin to associate tangible goods with prior owners starting in the 16th century, as if a chest or bedspread was now the chest or bedspread that had once belonged to a grandmother or parent, despite the fact that such links appear to have served no legal purpose. They demonstrate an investment in objects as bearers of one's past or history. The removal of one's personal belongings is one of the most dehumanizing parts of incarceration or hospitalization in many countries, as if this were to deprive the person of a part of their essential selfhood that is located in objects. Memory transfer sequences are common in science fiction stories, as though the basics of a human life could be removed and transplanted into another body or container. Endless lives are reduced to a finite set of algorithms stored in books in a large library in the current Westworld remake. However, there is always an excess, something that cannot be included, a residual that is inscribed and embodied in objects rather than being absorbed in a collection of declarative phrases. Memory isn't so much about storing or retrieving facts as it is about how we use and invest things, a process that happens all the time and isn't limited to conspicuous moments like the Proustian Madeleine or some relic that serves as a gateway to bittersweet memories. Phones and computers are part of a continuous endeavor to localize tough and sometimes overpowering experiences into images and words. Thus, technology certainly enhances this network. The narrative of Simonides, the Greek poet who was at a meal when the ceiling collapsed, was commonly cited as the origin of memory systems throughout the ancient and Renaissance periods. Nearly all of the visitors were slain, and identifying them from the mangled bodies was difficult. Simonides, on the other hand, was able to put names to the crushed bodies since he knew where they had been before the disaster. Thus, for those who would train this part of their mind, their physical location was used as a memory device, and the correlation between spatial position and words would become the principle of later mnemonic system construction. The order of the locations would retain the order of the things. There is a horrific loss of life and a sequence of crumpled bodies on the horizon of word retrieval. The relationship between memory and trauma and loss is difficult to study using word retrieval tests, and we may contrast their reductive model with the intricacy of a real person's memory. Changes in how memory is understood in the culture exert a subtle pressure on our real experience, where we can expect a memory to be like a still snapshot, a Super 8 video, a terrifying flashback, or a selfie. People are frequently unclear if they are really remembering something or if they are recalling a snapshot or a tale from their youth. Recollections, dreams, and sometimes new symptoms arrive to inflect this as people elaborate their thoughts and analysis, and a sense of history can be steadily created. In clinical practice, we frequently observe how a memory can appear as either an abstract piece of imagery devoid of any effective charge, or as an excruciating intensity. However, in both circumstances, the individual may learn to inhabit the memory in a new way, effectively repositioning themselves within it. For example, the memory of a childhood abuse may have always been associated with a particular emotional interpretation, as though the individual was responsible for an incident that was their own fault, perhaps due to a badness within. Inhabiting the memories may entail a reinterpretation. The other was at fault, not the person. In certain circumstances, such repositionings entail more than just a reassignment of responsibility. They may also entail a different identification of the figures involved or a different chronology within their lives. A scene in which they were a participant may turn out to be one in which they were a witness, or a childhood phobia may resurface after they have been separated from a loved one rather than before. These rewritings are fundamental to psychoanalysis and many talking therapies, and we can see how, After such a long and difficult process of inhabiting a memory, it can get the emotional charge that it lacked previously. Or, on the other hand, its intensity may disappear. This type of process is troubling not only for the person going through it, but also for a culture that requires good and evil, victim and aggressor to be cleanly separated. All respectable liberals were outraged by Trump's proposed border wall with Mexico, as though it would cement racist divisions between the good people on one side and the evil people on the other. Yet, as he evolved into the epitome of absolute evil, the same childlike distinctions were undoubtedly projected onto the guy himself. Even worse, when he made his infamous statements about the Charlottesville confrontations, implying that there were terrible people among the good people and good people in the bad people. It cast doubt on the rigidity of the distinctions that perhaps both Trump and some of his critics require. Ruth Lays has shown the gradual erasure of memory's richness in regard to traumatic event, mirroring binary divides between good and bad, inside and outside. During the latter half of the 20th century, trauma came to be thought of as a purely external event affecting an autonomous subject, a shift that is mirrored in the shift from guilt to shame, as evidenced by the disappearance of once popular concepts like identification with the aggressor and survivor guilt. The subject's unconscious involvement in the trauma is erased, despite the fact that the first of these principles was conceived prior to WWII. The reality of concentration camps gave striking confirmation. Inmates imitated the SS's verbal and physical aggressions, as well as their goals and objectives, hopes for unity with one's compatriots in misery. As Primo Levi put it, were typically dashed. There were instead 1,000 shut-off monads, and between them a frantic, covert, and continual fight. The public no longer reads the numerous bestseller camp testimonials from the late 1940s and 1950s, and we may desire to know less and less about human behavior in the camps. In its place arose what may be described as a late capitalist interpretation of the Holocaust. People survived not because of luck or chance, as nearly all of the early testimonies emphasize, but because of resilience and survival skills, concepts that come not from listening to survivors, but from the world of business, where they are regarded as necessary qualities to succeed in a competitive marketplace. Whereas previous testimony described inmates' brutalities and betrayals, a new focus on solidarity and tiny acts of kindness and giving began to emerge. Instead of being viewed as the result of meticulous research, it represents a shift in the fundamental framework of human subjectivity, which has been redefined in terms of the neoliberal market, rather of exploring our unconscious stance in traumatic events. The new psychologies, as Lays points out, construct and enforce a tight division between victim and agent. This has some quite drastic ramifications. Trauma-related phenomena like as dreams and flashbacks are interpreted as direct material duplicates of what happened, and thus stand outside all interpretation. As Lays puts it, the unconscious, fantasy, and the need to repeat themselves have no place here. These kinds of evasions are at the heart of the sleep studies we've been discussing. If someone lies awake, unable to shake the recurrence of particular images, or is awoken by intense and scary sensations, these could be interpreted as photographic impressions of an event that occurred to them. There is no need for further interpretation, as though there is nothing else to explain or comprehend. What could be more rational than to advocate for their removal once these nighttime phenomena are accepted as direct imprints of experience? Matthew Walker, a sleep hygienist, promotes memory deletion clearly, telling us that his goal is to create accurate procedures for selectively weakening or erasing certain memories from an individual's memory bank when there is a demonstrated therapeutic necessity. This kind of behavioral cleanliness is the stuff of countless Orwellian novels, and it taps into the segregative logic that supports some of humanity's most heinous excesses. It's certainly no coincidence that the idea of erasing people's memories has been so prevalent in the darkest future scenarios, and it begs the question of who confirms the clinical need: the patient, the doctor, or the state. What important here is refining one's place inside memories, which implies rewriting and resituating them within a history, rather than eliminating memories, which are incorrectly perceived as bits of information. From the early Roman attempt to obliterate all evidence of Domitian through the rewriting of Soviet school books to delete major occurrences in history, totalitarian governments have attempted to erase memory for many years. We can recall Macbeth's famous words, "Canst thou not minister to a diseased mind? Pluck a rooted grief from recollection, raise out the recorded woes of the brain, and cleanse the stuffed bosom of that deadly substance that weighs upon the heart with some beautiful oblivious antidote." This is made more worse when we consider that memories, unlike photos stored on a phone, are continually being rewritten, as psychologists have demonstrated since the early 20th century. They are reshaped and recrafted, amended and rerouted according to the shifting concerns of a life, and what we wish could or should have happened. Unlike certain copies of experience, memory is also tied to the social and political settings in which we live. So seeing it as solely a personal concern is misleading. What good would it do us to remember a tragic loss or disaster if the rest of our community or organization refuses to do so? What memory is here will be determined by what memory the other has. Memory, as anthropologists Leslie Dwyer and Dagun Santakarma point out, can't be reduced to the often simplistic notions of remembering and forgetting, as if one were taking a position against some external event. They apologized for asking questions that might have hurt a Balinese man who had lost his brother in the anti-communist cleansing of the 1960s, and had himself been imprisoned while interviewing him. "It wasn't you who reminded me," he responded. "I'll have these memories till I die, too. These recollections remind me that I am still alive." It's more important to give memories a voice and to allow these written issues to be articulated and clarified than to try to erase them. This way of thinking about memory also has another, possibly even more hazardous aspect. According to some sleep scientists, and REM sleep is responsible for weeding out and deleting superfluous brain connections, whilst REM sleep is responsible for strengthening them. And REM begins by removing extraneous information from a mass of autobiographical memory, and then REM strives to strengthen the connections that remain. This happens repeatedly during the sleep cycle, which alternates between the culling hand and the enhancing hand. Only the most crucial aspects must be strengthened and improved. Now, it's fascinating to see the lexicon of selection in this vision, a type of naive social Darwinism applied to memory systems, where the weak and superfluous are removed and the significant and strong are preserved. That can't one of the core concepts of eugenics, which divides parts of human life into the weak and strong, the unnecessary and the required, be heard in this. Any modern views of sleep and sleep hygiene are based on such distinctions. Culling and augmentation were, and still are, key notions in some of humanity's most tragic episodes. So it's disappointing to see sleep hygienists divide people into normal and abnormal, even declaring flatly that kids don't have rational minds while adults do. The sleep-deprived are a risk to society, whereas sleep permits the brain to be deeply cleansed. There are normal people who can read the world around them sensibly after a good night's sleep, and there are abnormal people who can't. They will be inaccurate in their social and emotional interpretation of the world, posing a threat to society because they will make wrong judgments and acts that may have fatal repercussions. What could be more logical than getting rid of the aberrant ones? By, of course, healing them. Trauma. Locating a traumatic memory is sometimes compared to finding a missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And this perspective is reflected in both published descriptions of clinical cases and media representations of traumatized people. Hellish thrillers and TV shows focus around a long-buried trauma that, when revealed, explains everything. Although there are undeniably parts from the past that, when remembered, can provide a fundamentally new picture of a life. The link between a traumatic memory and a story, as well as the link between trauma and memory, must often be questioned.